Welcome to Temple Talks, a new podcast from Temple Israel in Minneapolis, where Jewish wisdom meets our ever-changing world.
Join us as we talk with our favorite partners and thought leaders from around town and around the world.
We hope these talks will inspire you, challenge you, and give us all new ideas about Judaism, religious life, and social justice.
I'm Rabbi Klein.
Rabbi Hartman.
Rabbi Moss.
Cantor Abelson.
Rabbi Glazer.
And I'm Rabbi Zimmerman.
In early December, I spoke with Howard Mortman, the communications director at C-SPAN and the author of a new book detailing the history of rabbis offering prayer in Congress. I thought it would be a fitting episode to be released in mid-January, around the time of inauguration. And now, in light of the violent events at the Capitol on January 6th, the episode has all the more relevance. After this attack on the sacred duty of our elected representatives, and the ugly incursion of anti-Semitic symbols into the Capitol itself, let us consider the role that Jewish prayer has played within those hallowed halls. So, welcome to Temple Talks, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this, and it's a thrill. This is, I will tell you, I'm a first-time author. I'm a complete amateur at this. I'm an amateur at marketing book as well as writing a book. So thank you for including me. This is, I will tell you, this is my first time doing a podcast and doing this kind of venture for the book. So thank you for the maiden voyage here. Be gentle on me if you don't mind.
This is my first time interviewing for the podcast as well. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and there's kind of two main things that I'm interested in hearing about. One is definitely the content of the book and the nuggets that you dug up as you discovered all these rabbis who've come into Congress to offer prayers. But then I'd also love to hear about how someone who's not a Jewish professional gets involved in this Jewish project and what the building of this project has been like. Yeah,
sure. And in fact, in the classic politician's way, let me answer the second question first, as everybody in Washington does. The project itself, it's funny. You're totally right. I'm not a Jewish professional in any way. I mean, we have a Jewish household here. My wife and two kids, raised in Jewish. We belong to Temple Road of Shalom in Washington, D.C. area, in the Virginia suburbs, Reform congregation. But in no way am I an academic. I'm not a Jewish professional. I'm just a guy who is fascinated by history. The genesis of this book, and this book, as you mentioned, looks at rabbis who have opened Congress in prayer. We'll go a little bit more about that, what that means. Comes from my working at C-SPAN, which is the cable television network that shows Congress. It shows the floor of the House of Representatives and the floor of the Senate, complete gavel-to-gavel coverage. So as the PR guy, the media relations guy for C-SPAN, I watch a lot of C-SPAN. And so as a result, I also watch a lot of Congress. Part of watching Congress all day long, for better or for worse, I've always been fascinated by the very beginning of each session. And the very beginning of each session of Congress opens with a prayer. They do that. They pray even before they have the Pledge of Allegiance. It literally is the very first thing the House and the Senate does. So they have a chaplain in both the House and in the Senate. And it's typically a Christian prayer. Both the chaplain of the House and the Senate are Christians, Seventh-day Adventist in the Senate and a Catholic in the House. So it's there's nothing particularly Jewish about it. But the whole tradition itself I thought was just so interesting. Looks like nothing else that occurs in the legislative day. There's no fighting. There's nobody's arguing over its legislation or anything. It's just purely a prayer. On the rare occasions that there are guest chaplains, meaning clergy members who fill in for the regular chaplains. And on even rare occasions, those guest chaplains are rabbis. And that's basically where my story begins. It's looking at rabbis who have been guest chaplains in the House and the Senate, and going through history. And I've cataloged all of them who are the rabbis who've opened the House and the Senate in prayer. And I've cataloged who they are and what they've said. And that's basically what the project is. It's the first of its kind look at rabbis who have opened Congress in prayer. The story real for me began just by interest in Congress, but then it becomes a Jewish story from there.
Sure. It's kind of remarkable that the prayers offered even before the Pledge of Allegiance. That's really a special setting.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting. It's the first thing they do. And also, it's not a new phenomenon. They've been basically every session of Congress has opened in prayer from the very beginning, and from the very beginning, meaning from the 18th century, before there was a Bill of Rights. Congress was praying and had hired chaplains for both the House and the Senate. And it even goes back to the Continental Congress that Benjamin Franklin wanted to begin each session with a prayer. It's not a law, it's not a statute that they do this. It's more of just part of Congress's history that they do this. And that's why it's the very first thing they do. This tradition of opening government in a prayer has been protected in various cases, Supreme Court cases over the years where it's been challenged. Prayer happens at the beginning of city council meetings, happens at the beginning of local legislative. Nearly every state legislature opens with some kind of prayer. So it's a very widespread practice that has been challenged. That's gone up to the Supreme Court, and in a couple cases, it's been protected. So it very much is ingrained in the tradition of the legislative branch.
And when did Jews get in the game?
So Jews got in the game. The first guest chaplain in Congress was in the 1850s. Jews got in the game in the 1860s. The very first rabbi who prayed in Congress was his name is Rabbi Morris Raphael. Morris Raphael was for Congregation B'nai Jeshurun in New York City.
That's where I interned during rabbinical school.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, well then you have a direct link to the history of rabbis in Congress. He was the first one, and actually B'nai Jeshurun has had, I don't have a number in my head, but a number of rabbis since the first one have been from there, from that congregation. He was the first in 1860. James Buchanan was president, so predates even Abraham Lincoln. And when the contemporary accounts, like in the New York Times and other newspapers, of the shock of a rabbi showing up in Congress and praying, they use almost comical language of, here's somebody in costume and wearing his canonicals, they called it. And you could just imagine what it was like to be looking like a Jew, like a rabbi in the 1860s. And members of Congress were whispering to each other saying, what's going on here? One footnote to the history of this rabbi, Rabbi Morris Raphael, born in Sweden, moved to America. He was pro-slavery. He actually was, even though he was a northern rabbi, he was on the side of the South, the Confederacy, in the Civil War. There's a whole interesting history behind this Rabbi Morris Raphael. But he was the first, and was the first of, now there have been over 430 rabbis who have prayed in Congress, and there have been about 640 total rabbi prayers in Congress. The difference in numbers is because about 100 of the rabbis have prayed multiple times, 2 or more times. There have been a rabbi has done it more than one time. So over 400 rabbis have prayed over 600 times since 1860, leading up to this year.
And does a rabbi get invited by the primary chaplain, or does he or she just walk in there and say, I'm praying today?
That's a great question. No, so the invitation comes from typically, more times than not, it comes from the local congressman or the local senator will be the one who sponsors a rabbi from his or her community. So when it's the time for Rabbi Tobias Moss to come and give the prayer opening Congress, typically it would be your local congressman or woman doing the invite. Not always. 2 exceptions. Sometimes there have been members of Congress from a different state, different community, who are just close or friends with the rabbi, and they've done the inviting. Or on several occasions, in what is called it's going to be a confusing term, a pro forma session of the House, meaning when the House is just in for a couple minutes just to maintain its legislative duties. Then there are also rabbis who are invited by the chaplain's office to do that. Typically, that rabbi is from the Washington, D.C. area. just for proximity, because it's not a true legislative session.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, it is a member of Congress who's doing the inviting, both in the House and in the Senate.
Okay, and the main chaplains are appointed by what's the process around the main chaplains, or what's the proper title?
Sure, the proper title is chaplain, chaplain of the House and chaplain of the Senate. They are both elected by the House itself. So, and actually in January, when the new Congress is elected, they will also, believe it or not, have elections for the new chaplain. They can be fired. The chaplains, typically they're not, but it's, this is part of the administrative staff of the House. Just looking at the House, of the House Representatives. You have the chaplain, again, the incumbent right now, his name is Father Conroy, really interesting fellow. He's a Catholic, and he has his own staff. He's paid by the taxpayers, has his own staff to help him out, to assist. The chaplain of the House and the chaplain of the Senate, their duties aren't only to pray, to open each session in prayer. They also minister to members of Congress. They have private meetings during particularly difficult times. A member will come to the House or Senate chaplain. They've conducted weddings. They do other events, or they they appear at other official events that involve the House outside of the chamber and offer prayers. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different activities that they do, different ministering that these chaplains get involved in.
Great. And there's not yet been a Jewish chaplain of the House or chaplain of the Senate as a full-time?
There has not been a Jewish chaplain full-time.
I know we have Navy admirals and other higher ups, but
yeah, no, it's actually part of the my work on this project. I've been in touch with a lot of rabbis who have given prayers, and it may or may not surprise you that there is some jockeying, that there are rabbis who fancy themselves worthy of the position of chaplain of Congress. And I know firsthand of a couple of rabbis who would love to have that job. It doesn't come open that often, but like any other thing in Washington, there's there's politics behind some of these choices. So there are rabbis who would like to have that position. But no, there hasn't been. Your mention of military chaplains actually is kind of interesting. There have been about 55 military chaplains, Jewish military chaplains, who have prayed in the House and in the Senate. And a number of them have actually worn their military uniforms. So when they've prayed, so there is some crossover. There's crossover. Military chaplains have prayed in, Congress. Rabbi military chaplains have prayed in Congress as well.
Mm-hmm. And have there been Jewish lay people that have done the same, or cantors?
Yeah, cantors, no. Cantors.
Is the prayer ever sung generally?
Well, these are really good questions. There have been rabbis who have also been cantors, but standalone cantors, no. In fact, if I get my history right, and I've written down here from Temple Israel, the Rabbi Albert Minda, historically part of Temple. I believe he was also a cantor as well as being a rabbi. He has given the prayer. He gave the prayer in Congress in 1964. I'm going way back, so there have been crossover. No standalone cantors. I don't want to say outright the prayers had never been sung, because what I know of the prayers that exist on video, and the video going back to the creation of C-SPAN back in 1979, prayers that were given before that I can see in the congressional record, but I can't see necessarily. There's no video or audio recording of them, so I don't think so. But I don't want to say outright. Now, one interesting aspect of this are prayers that have been given in Hebrew. And for that, there is video, and I do have video of prayers prayers have been blessed. There have been rabbis who have blessed Congress, and I believe the Shekhinah, the original, going back to the giving countenance upon the legislature, so the oldest Torah, has been given in Hebrew. this is going to get into the weeds, but there are rules now. The House chaplain has rules. You can't give prayers in foreign languages anymore. So there are no longer prayers in Hebrew, but there were at a time. And in fact, one of the joys of doing this research has been finding Hebrew in the Congressional Record. So if you go back, they printed Hebrew in the Congressional Record from rabbis who gave prayers. So I don't see singing, but they have been in Hebrew.
So since you mentioned the Congressional Record and that you've seen a lot of this on video, have those been your two main sources of digging these up?
Exactly right. So I've been working on this project for about 6 years. The two big buckets is video, one bucket video and audio.
All C-SPAN?
All C-SPAN, that's right. And the C-SPAN began broadcasting in 1979. So prayers that have happened since then, many of them appear on video through a quirk. Not all of them do, because we didn't start archiving them until 1985. So this kind of gets in the weeds here. But for every prayer since 1985, I typically have. For those in this 1979 to 1985 world, I don't have, because the video doesn't exist. So that's the big bucket, number one, the video archives. Before the existence of television broadcast of Congress, and that, again, the House 79, the Senate began in 1986, TV broadcast. Mm-hmm. Before that, it's only the Congressional Record. So it involved a lot of digging through the Congressional Record, basically looking through every prayer ever uttered and by anybody, going back to 1860 and trying to figure out who was a rabbi, who wasn't a rabbi. And you can't really search the Congressional Record for the word rabbi. It doesn't work like that. You have to go through every prayer for a couple reasons. One of which, Jews don't make it easier on ourselves. We used to call ourselves the rabbis
Reverend, minister.
Exactly right. Exactly. Which, for whatever reason, they called themselves reverend and minister. In the early days of the Congressional Record, it became minister this, minister that, even if the person was a rabbi. So the rabbis don't exist as rabbis till like the 1930s or 1940s, making it difficult on amateur sleuths like myself to figure out who was a rabbi and who wasn't. So it just involves searching.
In the Union Prayer Book, the turn of the century prayer book of the Reform movement, it says, congregation responds, but then it says minister leads or reverend leads. So I've seen that around.
Yeah, it is. I tell you, it really still is odd to see that. I mean, it's not a modern sensibility to call rabbis ministers. And I've seen those in the prayer books, and it just becomes even weirder when you see in the Congressional Record when it's like Minister Rabinowitz, for an example. It's just an odd juxtaposition of seeing minister and a clearly Jewish person giving the prayer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so for those who are listening, this is actually my first conversation with Howard, because Howard is also posting daily on social media of, on this date in whatever year there was this prayer was given in Congress by a rabbi. And so you put up a prayer from Temple Israel. And so I reposted that, and then this is how we connected. And also I mentioned that my foremost connection to an American Jewish historian is Gary Zola, Rabbi Gary Zola in Cincinnati, who runs the American Jewish Archives and is a mentor. What was your connection with the archives or with Rabbi Zola himself?
So great. So, and first of all, let me just say that thanks to you being a social media expert and a guru to spot that, you're the first one. I've been posting these on these dates. Like, basically, I want to add all my research done to the public. Like, it doesn't do any good sitting in a Google Excel sheet, on my computer. So that's what my way of contributing is, just put this on social media. Rabbi Moss, you're the first one to actually spot that and say, hey, let's talk more about this. So thank you for your sleuthing, your online sleuthing for that. Rabbi Zola, Gary Zola of the Hebrew Union College, as you mentioned, runs the American Jewish Archives based in Cincinnati. My connection to him, well, it's actually, it goes back really deep. Pre-C-SPAN for me, as a Jewish guy growing up, I attended a summer camp in Wisconsin, Olin Seng Ruby in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. And he was the rabbi there, and I was there back in the 1970s. Every summer, my parents would ship me up there. And in the back of my head, I kind of have a vague memory of Rabbi Zola being the rabbi there.
His red hair sticks out.
You know what? It just sticks out in my cerebral as well as in the pictures from those eras. You're totally right. The red hair sticks out. And I just always remember the name. I also went to Camp Harlem, which was a Jewish camp in,
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, that's right. So, and I can't remember he was part of that, but I know he's part of Olin St. Ruby in Conomowoc, Wisconsin. So, it's like one of these names, memories that just stuck in the back of my head. As I began doing this research, I came across his name again. And I said, boy, that's totally familiar, that name. I came across him, Rabbi Zola, because he himself has given the prayer twice in Congress, once in the House and once in the Senate. And I believe it was like the early 2000s. He was there in the Senate, sponsored by in the House, sponsored by then Congressman Rob Portman from Ohio, who's now a senator, and was there to mark the 350th anniversary of the Jewish community in America. So I saw this prayer, part of my archiving of these prayers, and I just sent him a letter, an outreach to say hello. I actually then, just by re-befriending him over email, I flew up to Cincinnati to just visit the archives. I used their online version of the archives extensively to the research of this. And Gary Zola is now actually one of the 16 rabbis who is on the cover of the book, giving the prayer. He's absolutely been a great help in the production of this book.
Nice. I took an intensive 10-day course with him on the early American Jewish experience, and we were in Cincinnati and then in Charleston. We had to write a paper on whatever interested us by making use of the archive. So I did a paper on the blue laws, on the Sunday prohibitions or the prohibitions on working on Sundays and how that affected the Jewish community. And since I grew up in Bergen County, New Jersey, which is one of the last remaining counties to have no retail on Sunday, that was of interest to me. And what was fascinating in that exploration was certain Jewish leaders being pro these prohibitions as long as there was Jewish exceptions to it. Like Jews could work on Sunday because we're taking off Saturday, but they liked the principle of the government stepping in to prevent too much work on the Sabbath. And then other Jews who said this is, violating church and state rules. So I'm sure even with this, like you were mentioning at the outset, that there's probably some opposition to this overall practice of prayer in our state bodies. But also, since given that there is, it's good that Jews are getting represented as such. Yeah, you know what? Thank you for bringing that up. The church-state part of this it looms over this whole practice. I mean, it's just you can't really talk about this topic without the inevitable church-state conversation. What I will say about what I did, my work, my book, my research doesn't get into that debate at all. For this reason, that's a debate that people have, church versus state, ad infinitum. It's a battle that continues to go on. My perspective is, sure, that's a legitimate debate, and it's fascinating debate. But the fact is, there have been over 400 rabbis who have prayed in Congress for 160 years. It's worthy of study. It's worthy of knowing by the history itself. Even if you disagree with the practice, and you're like everything else in America, you're welcome to disagree. Say the government shouldn't be doing this. The government should be paying for a chaplain. The government should be having prayer. You can make all those arguments. They're legitimate, sound arguments. For me, sure, but I still am interested in the history and in some of the amazing stories that come out of this. We've established earlier in the conversation, this has been protected by the Supreme Court. So it's part of the tradition, and it will remain part of the tradition. So my attitude is, you can have the argument. This book is not an argument about that. This book is a look at the history of these hundreds of Jews, of rabbis who have prayed. One thing I will say I don't know of any rabbi who would turn down the opportunity to be invited to give a prayer in Congress. I mean, it clearly is an honor. Within the context of church state, I remember
Rabbi Frank Lautenberg, famous Jewish senator from New Jersey, sponsored a rabbi from New Jersey who gave the prayer in the U.S. Senate. Oh gosh, this was back in the early 2000s, I believe. When after a rabbi gives a prayer, then the sponsoring member of Congress, senator or congressman, gets up and makes remarks about the rabbi. Senator Lautenberg sponsored this rabbi, and among the great attributes that Lautenberg said about this rabbi was his great work on church-state issues and keeping church-state separate, which is, sure, but the rabbi just gave a prayer in Congress, so it's just I don't, that's why the rabbi who would say no, I won't give a prayer in Congress, when that happens, I'll be shocked, surprised and shocked. Happens.
That's funny. So let's dive into some of the stories and phenomena you've discovered within the research. You want to tell us what the first female leader of a prayer in Congress was, or the first rabbinic leader?
Sure. And actually, I love this story. Her name, Rabbi Sally Prezand, and Sally Prezand is known historically as the first ordained rabbi in America, ordained, I believe, in 1972, and she gave the prayer a year later, and I think she was in her late 20s when she gave the prayer in 1973, in October 1973. A couple of things that are remarkable about her prayer: the first Jewish rabbi, sponsored by Congresswoman Bella Abzug, who is known for being famous Jewish, since dead, but famous Jewish Congresswoman from New York. In Sally Prezand's prayer, she didn't make any mention of the history of her being there, the first Jewish rabbi, the first woman rabbi. But Bella Abzug, in her remarks, Bella Abzug mentioned her prayer being the first by a woman. One really interesting coda to this: it's tough to find Sally Prezand's prayer in the congressional record because they misspelled her name. Her name is spelled Priesand. The congressional record transposed the E and the I, Preisand. So the first woman rabbi, tough to find her because they got the name wrong. So,
and was she the first female clergy, or had there been other?
No, it's not the first female clergy, but the first female clergy was not too long before Rabbi Prezand. I forget her name, but it was in the era of the 1970s when there were a lot of firsts. The first Native American clergy person, I believe from South Dakota, was also in the 1970s. The first African American guest chaplain was probably about 5-10 years before that. So this was very much an era. There have been 14 rabbis, including Sally Prezand, women rabbis, who have given the prayer in the year since. The period of time between Rabbi Prezand's prayer and the next one was 12 years, separating the two of them, 1973 to 1985. Only one woman rabbi, has given the prayer more than one time. Rabbi Hannah Spiro, of a Reconstructionist rabbi from Hill Havra.
We interacted in our rabbinic journey a bit in some interdenominational workshops and whatnot.
Yeah. So right. Okay. Great. She's young, as a rabbi for many Capitol Hill folks, being in D.C., and she's given twice. So she's the first one to pray, the first female rabbi to pray twice.
Gotcha. And what nuggets do you have from the Minnesota Jewish experience? And many of our members grew up at other synagogues in Minnesota, or in Hibbing, or in Duluth. So interested in all of it.
Yeah, I actually love the Minnesota part. Believe it or not, Minnesota looms large in the story. And I have a couple of facts to share with everybody. First of all, the rabbi who has given the prayer most in Congress, not a Minnesota rabbi, he has prayed 17 times. His name is Rabbi Arnold Reznikov. And Arnold Reznikov just gave a prayer a couple of weeks ago, and a retired Navy chaplain, 17 prayers. But the number 2 rabbi, believe it or not, is a Minnesota rabbi. And the rabbi is Rabbi Moshe Feller, who's a Lubavitcher rabbi from Minnesota, and has given the prayer 9 times. So he's second most of any of the rabbis. So Minnesota is well represented at the top. Temple Israel itself in your temple has given the prayer, and this actually is interesting. 4 times it's been represented in Congress. And
do you have there which rabbis?
Rabbi Albert Minda in 1964, Rabbi Stephen Pinsky 1989, and 2 from Rabbi Max Shapiro 1979 and 1985. Now, the 3 most recent, Pinsky and the 2 Shapiros, sponsored by a member, I don't know if he's still a member, but member of Temple Israel, Rudy Boschwitz, a senator from Minnesota, who was defeated in 1990 by Paul Wellstone.
Okay.
Boschwitz sponsored 3 rabbis from Temple Israel. So anyway, well, we're represented in the history of prayers in Congress.
Very nice. Yeah. And has the Jewish preponderance gone up over time? Have we had a heyday where we were more frequent? After that 1860 first one, was it a long time until we got back?
That's a great question. No one's asking that because the on average, if you look at just the raw numbers, rabbis give prayers in Congress about 7 times a year since World War II. Now, I will throw in immediately, this year is different, obviously, because of the virus. There hasn't been many guest chaplains at all this year. There have been 4 rabbis who have given prayers this year. So this is kind of, if you look at the curve, this is definitely an outlier. But if you take away this, if you're into metrics, if you throw away this year, we average about 7 rabbis a year. The heyday, believe it or not, was during the Vietnam War, when you just a real surge of rabbis giving prayers for whatever reason. And the message of Vietnam was part of, you can see it in the prayer itself, in the content, in the language that they used. And you can almost see the swing of embracing the Vietnam War as America embraced the Vietnam War. And then as America turned against the war, the language and the rabbis' prayers turned against the Vietnam War. 1967 in particular, probably the bloodiest year of America's involvement. You see a lot of rabbis gave prayers that year and started to, even though you're really not supposed to talk about current events like this, it was impossible to do a prayer at that time for anybody without mentioning our troops overseas. Citing Isaiah 2:4, turn your plowshares into prunings, citing that, more of that citation. And in fact, I think it was 2 or 3 rabbis gave prayers during June 67, which historically is the 6-day war in Israel, and didn't mention the 6-day war at all in their prayers, but did mention Vietnam, or gave a kind of a broad reference. Yeah, an implicit reference to Vietnam during their prayers. So that's kind of, to use your word, I love the word heyday. That's kind of the golden age of rabbinical prayers in Congress during Vietnam.
Do you have I don't know if you have favorites, but do you have a most eloquent rabbi you've found? Does it get redundant to read so many of these prayers, or are there really unique takes?
It's a great question. And I will tell you, having seen and read through 634 prayers, there are a couple duds. there are a couple that do nothing for me, meaning that their language is not particularly inspiring, or, it's repetitive. That said, there are a couple of them that really spoke to me or taught me or allowed me to see even Judaism, or instructed me, or mentioning prophets or Pirkei Avot, or just like different Jewish tradition. The one prayer that really struck out as me, this happened only recently, and it's kind of a personal story. Part of what I've been doing in my research is, for when there is video of a prayer, I've been putting them on YouTube. So you can see Minnesota, you can see
Rabbi Pinsky.
exists on YouTube exactly for 1989, as well as Senator Boschwitz's remarks sponsoring him. So I've been mechanically putting all these prayers on YouTube and creating playlists for both rabbis and their sponsors. One of the rabbis I put on YouTube was a Rabbi Maurice Lyons from St. Louis. And Maurice Lyons gave the prayer in 1994 in the Senate. And he has since died. So he's just one of the rabbis I put on YouTube, and I move on to the next rabbi. About a month ago, I got an email or a Facebook note, an email out of the blue from the family of Rabbi Maurice Lyons, from one of his grandkids, who had stumbled over this YouTube, just Googling Rabbi Lyons. They were marking his yahrzeit, the anniversary of his death, and they had never seen, not only had they never seen this prayer, they didn't know that he had done a prayer in Congress, and had actually never even heard his voice for their kids. And they sent me a note saying how great it was, a service to them to see his prayer in the Senate. And I wrote back, that's really nice, but what even greater service to be able to hear your reaction to seeing this and just to be part of the yahrzeit of the prayer. And it turned out, it's really interesting because I mentioned rabbis who have prayed in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. This Rabbi Lyons gave a big prayer. At the end, he gave countenance and blessed and raised his hand very dramatically and spoke in Hebrew over the Senate. And it had always struck me, just going through all the prayers, that was so interesting how he just, as a rabbi does over a congregation, over a synagogue.
The priestly blessing?
The priestly blessing,
mm-hmm.
I believe is in Numbers, if I right, and gave the priestly blessing over the Senate. Amazing moment, but that was his. And so the whole thing kind of came full circle. So it was a very humanizing moment for me to be able to connect with a family like that.
That's great. Yeah, I think, I don't know if anyone in Temple Israel's congregation or those who are listening have their own, pet projects they've considered pursuing within the Jewish world, but it sounds like, lots of connections can be sparked by pursuing a project like this. And it sounds like rabbis made themselves available to you as you did your research and the archive also. Did you hit any roadblocks along the way to putting this together?
Well, no roadblocks from my own research. The biggest roadblock, and this will not come as a shock, there's not much of a market in the publishing world for a book about rabbis who pray in Congress. So the biggest roadblock came after I did everything wrong. I wrote it before I had anybody interested in publishing it. And you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to pitch the concept and then find somebody. I just found that I couldn't pitch this. It was really tough to explain without formulating the entire book first. So I did it wrong. So I wrote the book first and then I pitched. 100 pitches later, I came across a publishing house that said, "We love this." And I said, "My goodness, are you guys crazy? Why do you love this book?" And I was so fortunate. The publisher, Academic Studies Press, is the name of the publisher, based in Boston. They specialize in two types of books: Jewish books and Slavic books. So I didn't write a Slavic book, but I very much wrote a Jewish book, and they gave me a chance on this. Part of this, I went into partnership with, and I have to give a plug to Washington Hebrew Congregation, which is a Reformed congregation based here in DC. They had in order to make this somewhat marketable, I had to put some skin in the game, some money. So a partnership with Washington Hebrew Congregation. They sponsor. There's a publishing term called a subvention, where you guarantee a certain number of sales. So Washington Hebrew Congregation guaranteed a certain number of sales. As a result, the book, it says it's in partnership with them. So without their involvement, the book probably wouldn't have happened. And without my publisher saying, we'll take a risk on this. So, in the end, I'm thrilled and grateful to both Washington Hebrew Congregation and to my publisher for supporting this. I will say it's very important for me to say that this is not solely a Jewish book. This is a book for lovers of Congress history, for junkies of American history. This is a book for people who are just interested in the overall tradition of prayer in Congress. for me being Jewish, it's the entrance for that topic, that discussion. It's the gateway to talking about it. But it would be wrong to say that the Jewish participation in this tradition is dominating. It's not. It's a very small sliver of the overall practice. So this really, I hope, appeals to people who aren't Jewish, who just want to be exposed to a big tradition of Congress they may not be aware of, and that's opening each session in prayer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where can people find this book?
So going through my publisher's site, the Academic Studies Press. I have to mention them because we support independent bookstores, and so you can find it on my website. The website is When Rabbis Bless Congress. And you can just Google that, when rabbisblesscongress.com. You'll come up with this, and it'll send you right to purchase pages. Of course, you can buy it on Amazon. Just Googling my name, Howard Mortman. Be it in support of independent bookstores. We almost prefer people support your local businessmen, independent. But basically, you can even buy it by going to the websites of Target and Walmart. Believe it or not, sells the books.
Oh, great.
Yeah, if you don't like the book and you get it from Walmart, you can just return it and get a bunch of toilet paper instead. So, so feel free.
If there's any left on the shelves in Minnesota.
Exactly right. And actually, speaking of which, since Target's a Minnesota-based,
exactly,
this is you're kosher. Just through Target.
That's local business for us.
Right. Come to think of it, yeah. So since this is you're going to put this on in January, that's when the new Congress begins. So just be interested to see who the next rabbi will be praising Congress. Mm-hmm. And this podcast comes on after the Hanukkah gift giving season. Don't forget about Purim gifts and Passover gifts. So this will make the perfect gifts for those holidays as well.
Perfect. So thank you so much for joining us for Temple Talks. It's great getting to know you and the project.
Thank you, Rabbi, so much. Wonderful to be part of this. Thank you.
Hello, listener. We'd love to hear from you, what you thought about this week's episode, any comments or questions. So those can be directed to tmoss@templeisrael.com. As well, we would love for you to subscribe to the podcast so that it can find you easily each time that it comes out. Go to templetalks.org and hit the button subscribe. Thanks again for listening.